Amen. Well, again, good morning. Let's just give a little round of applause, a little bit of love to Tom for being here this morning, leading us in worship. Thank you so much. Thank you. We also welcome those, as he's already kind of welcomed those online. Whatever you're doing this morning, we just thank you for logging in and checking in with us. And we're just glad that you're here in person as well. Aren't you just glad to be at church? There's just something about, I know it's not the normal. And eventually we're going to quit saying that, you know what I mean? But for now, what else are we going to say? You know, it is what it is. And so we look forward to the times where we're going to have, Wednesday nights as we used to, where we're going to share food and sit in circles instead of rows and, not have the face coverings on and be able to talk and be able to hug. I look forward to being in the back. I'm missing Wednesday nights, and I'm missing the back more than I'm missing, what I was missing, the preaching. And I love preaching, but I love you guys, and I love just being able to be close to y'all. And so I miss y'all the way we used to know each other, right? There's this story that we've been working through, at least this series we've been working through stories, but today's story really has been on my heart for a few weeks now. And it really has, to me, it kind of relates to where we are. Where we feel weary, and some people may not be weary of doing a lot of things. There's some that have been working harder through this time, but there's some that, been working less. And to me, working hard and being weary from working hard and being just overly worked, but there's also a weary in just, there's no purpose, right? You feel like, well, I'm not doing a whole lot. There's in that. And so either way, we feel overwhelmed. I don't know about you, but I sense that we're overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed by the media. We're overwhelmed by the negativity. We're overwhelmed by something's happening in early November that you probably know about, that's coming up. And so we're worried about all that. We're worried about all these things, the uncertainty of it all. We just don't know. And if there's anything we learn in all this, we have zero control. That if something that we can't even weigh, we can't even measure, we can't even see, if this will shut down not just Nacogdoches, not just the United States of America, but the world. But there's the other side of this. And this is what gives me hope and what God's reminding. This has nothing to do with this. This is just me setting this up, okay? Here it is. That Jesus said the faith of a mustard seed will move mountains. So if there's little that can be used for just destruction, what little bit of faith can help us change perspectives on this? Because if we can't change this, if we can't do anything about this, we can pray for the people who can do something about it. Those scientists and those doctors and those physicians and those politicians and all those people who are making decisions and leading us. And if anybody you should be praying for, it's the school boards, and it's the leadership, it's the teachers, and it's the parents who are dealing with that, and it's all the nurses and the doctors that have already been into this, and it's our own university here in our community that we need to be praying that God is intervening, because I believe He's already been doing that. We believe that. So all this feeds into the story, because at sometimes in life, what God is asking us and what He's placed us in the middle of, we seem like we're ill-equipped for this. And we don't have the preparations. We don't have the resources to meet that need. And we're just worn out. We're just weary. We're ready for something else. And this is kind of where we find this story. And we're just going to title it, You Feed Them. Because I want us to kind of take some responsibility. Because yes, we're supposed to have faith that God can do something. We're supposed to have faith that, hey, God, we want this vaccine. But we more important than the vaccine, we want a treatment. We want to know that this is what's going to work. And so we want all of these things. We want God, we want to do this. But that's for everybody. But what about you? What about your circumstance? What if God sometimes will turn that around and say, why don't you be part of the solution? Why don't you be part of the prayer request? Why don't you be the answer to someone else's prayer request? What if He turns it around on us? These disciples, they had been with Jesus, right? I mean, this is early in following Him, but His popularity had already kind of been kind of gaining some steam. And so at this point, He had been ministering to people throughout the day. It's probably well into the afternoon, where they would have normally probably had a lunch break, but we kind of get the idea that they probably didn't have a lot of time to eat and a lot of time to relax. And then on top of that, they said, okay, well, let's just go across. They spent 75% of Jesus' ministry was around the Sea of Galilee. So this Galilean region, he would go back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. And so they're going to go across Galilee. And you have to kind of think about this time. In the disciples' mind, they're thinking, okay, we got to unplug from ministry for just a moment. And they got to unwind on the boat. Now, they had their own responsibilities of the boat. They knew a storm could happen at any time. But in this time, it didn't happen. But what happened was they got to the other side, and all of a sudden the people heard somehow. They weren't tweeting and they weren't texting each other, hey, he's coming across. They didn't know that. They just somehow realized, hey, this is Jesus, and word spread like that. And people began to gather. Now this is, let's just bring the human side. And I want you to make you feel a little bit better. Imagine the disciples, they're tired, they're hungry. I don't know, and I'm a guy, so I understand what being hangry feels like. Ladies, I don't know how many of you feel that way, okay? You get hangry, you get hungry and angry, and that's where we come down. So they're getting that way, and they're tired on top of that. So I don't know, you can make a word up for that. I don't know what that is, just grumpy. Let's just call it that, okay? This is where we find these guys. In Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. And I promise you the rest of the message is not going to be as long as the intro, okay? So just relax. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that he had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. So their promise, right? Let's go rest a little bit. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. So they're hungry, they're tired. We get all that. Verse 32. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. They're thinking, okay, we get to escape. We get a little bit of vacay here a little bit. Verse 33. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So I don't know if they could see the people running or whatever, but you can kind of just get the sense that, oh good, oh man, they see us, they've heard us, we can't hide. Oh, so they're just deflated, even though they're ministering to people and all that. But again, you get to see that human side of this. I don't want to help anybody anymore. I don't want to love. I don't want to talk to. I don't want to see anybody. Just lock the door, turn the phone off, and just unplug, right? But they couldn't do that. So, verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had what on them? That's a key word here. We sometimes don't have the compassion that Jesus wants us to have because we're wrapped up in our own stuff and we've got all these excuses, right? He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And what that means is he preached a long time. Verse 35, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. That's a nice way of saying it's getting late. You've been talking way too long. We're in the middle of nowhere. There's not a Chick-fil-A around here, so are you going to make some Jesus chicken in front of us? What's going to happen here? We are hungry. There's nowhere to... And again, we haven't eaten. Remember, we didn't eat lunch. You didn't give us a lunch break. Verse 36, send them away and go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So we're done here, basically. They determined that Jesus was done and said they can go feed themselves. And they said to him, shall we go? Or let me back up because I lost track here. Verse 37, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? So they're making this, just claim of, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of bread. And I don't know that we have that. Maybe they're looking at Judas like, how much money do we have? And whatever. They're just banging up this big number, knowing that they can't feed them. In verse 38, and he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. So do our blessings matter before we eat? We're about to find out. And he broke the loaves and gave it to them, to the disciples, to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. So there's 12 disciples, right? So that was the miracle in itself to divide it to the 12. And then all of a sudden they spread out and the miracle multiplies. In verse 42, and they all ate and were satisfied, which means their bellies were full. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000. Notice this, 5,000 men. Because women and children weren't counted for. What we need to understand about this is the disciples, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more, but the disciples were the ones who were hungry. The disciples were the ones who were weary. And they thought, okay, we're hungry, we're weary, but they began to turn it on, okay, well, the people are hungry. The people are tired. Why don't they go and feed themselves? Why don't they go? And so they turned it around and blamed it on the people, right? That they're the ones who are in need. What they should have said is, we're hungry. Can you send them away? And so Jesus turns it around. In fact, Mark chapter 6:35, this is kind of where they have this dialogue. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, in the middle of nowhere, and the hour is now late, nothing's open. Send them away and go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered, you give them something to eat. And so here's the line I want to kind of just take away from this. Is when we ask God, will you? When we say, God, will you do this? Will you do that? He sometimes responds, why don't you? And I go back to the whole introduction is, what if sometimes God is wanting us to be the answer, maybe not just to our own prayer request and be part of that, but what if there's someone out there that's just praying for connection, praying that someone cares, praying for just a sign that someone knows that they're alive and knows that they're hurting and they're going through something. And so what if in the midst of this, if they're on your prayer request, if something's on your prayer request, say, God, I want to do something for you. Why don't you do something for them? Why don't you do something for this person and this family? And what if in response he says, well, why don't you call them? And I know times are different where we feel a little bit weird about bringing, our own meal over that we made in our kitchen. I understand times are different, but there's no substitute for just picking up the phone. There's no substitute for just sending a card. And there's no substitute for just reaching out and say, I was just praying and God brought your name to mind. How are you doing? How often are we so focused on just, okay, my role is to pray. My role is to, God, do this. Save them. Right? We as believers and Christ followers, we want people to come to know Jesus, right? And we hopefully pray that often. We believe that as a church, just like every other little C church in this community in the world that's preaching the gospel, right? We understand that. But what if God's response, and he's always kind of just trying to whisper in the midst of our pace and our life, and he's trying to say, hey, who have you witnessed to recently? What if, as we're saying, God, will you reach them? Will you save them? Will you help them overcome this addiction? Will you help them through this hard time? What if in the midst of that, if we just pause and quit talking in our prayers for just a second and just listen, and maybe God says, why don't you be part of that? Why don't you do something? More than just praying for them, which is good. But the problem is, we get so overwhelmed by what we see, and we say, well, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't have the words. I don't have the resources. We start complaining. And this is what, again, the disciples began to do. Instead of saying, okay, we accept it. Okay, I get it. You want us to feed them. You want us to be part of that. We essentially back up and we say, why we can't do it. We begin to give all the excuses where I don't have the time. What if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? Well, what if it's this and what if it's that? Well, who are you that God can't use? And if you're praying for God to reach someone, if you're praying for God to be compassionate on someone, if you're praying for God to encourage someone, what if just by them being on your heart and on your mind, you are the one that's supposed to come alongside and be part of the solution? Verse 37 says, and they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? Kind of sarcastically. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? And obviously, if they had some on themselves, they wouldn't be complaining, right? If they had food, they would have been sneaking off to the side 2 by 2 and coming back full, right? So they didn't have it in themselves. So go and see is what he said. Why don't you go check the crowd and see what they have? And when they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. So you begin to kind of do the math, all right? You understand what's happening here. He says, okay, you're hungry, and if you're hungry, they're probably hungry. So why don't we do something spectacular? They didn't have any idea what he was up to, okay? He was the only one who knew what he was about to do. And so they were like, okay, we don't have anything, so let's go find out. So you can imagine the spirit of which they probably went out, right? They're hungry, they're angry, and they're just altogether grumpy, okay? And so they're looking around, they're going, okay, do you have anything? Do you have anything? And we're not talking about just 5,000 men. If we include the women and the children in this who were uncounted, we're talking about 10,000 to 15,000 people. And so think about the magnitude of this. They know they're going out empty-handed. And someone in the crowd probably asked, what are you doing? Why are you asking for food? Why should we give you food? This is my food. Do you imagine that's going on a little bit? Do you imagine that all that they came back with was all that was out there? Don't you know that there were some selfish people and some unbelievers out there? Maybe it was some churchy people out there that saw them coming, heard what they were asking for, and they had a little piece of bread, and they had a little sardine, and they go, and we don't know that for sure, and I'm not trying to read into it. I'm just saying, people are people. We saw what we do to toilet paper around here. You know what I mean? So, come on now. No, I'm not going to check your closets or anything like that, but here we go. All right. So we don't know how much was out there. We just know how much they came back with. The way I like to look at this is I like to look at it as this little kid who had a sack lunch and he was just innocent enough to give it up. Because as adults, so often, we're looking out for who? And the moms and the dads are looking out for who? Theirs. Theirs. Now we don't know that. We don't know that. But I like to believe that. I like to see it from that standpoint. So here's the next line. Jesus never asked us to do everything. That's a misunderstanding, I think, from all of us, is that we get overwhelmed because we see this big problem. We see this, everybody's hurting, everybody's hungry, everybody needs a hug, right? Everybody's this and everybody's that. Jesus never asks us to do everything, but here's what he does. Only the one thing that we can do. The one thing we can do. Jesus, as he's teaching the disciples to pray, he offers this outline. And one part of, a friend of mine pointed out to me this week, and he said, you think about this part in the prayer where he says, give us our daily bread. And don't you know there's something, and I don't want to get too deep into this theologically or whatever, muddy the water here, but you wonder why we're limited to days, right, on this side of eternity. And why on the other side of eternity, when we get to heaven, that there's no night. And so it's not even considered day, it's just, this is life. I mean, that's it. There's no end to it. It's just, you don't wake up, you are up. And what that looks like is just mind-boggling to me. And so when you think about, we are limited. We need our rest. We need our food. We need our substance. We need all those things. We need companionship. We need all this. And so what he's probably saying in this, and what Jesus was saying is, give us our daily bread. He wasn't just talking to the poor people, because there was no middle class at that time. He wasn't just talking to them saying, okay, you understand you're dependent on your daily bread, because they were. He was basically saying in a bigger, broader picture is that, are you trusting God for all of your needs every day? And are you just focused on this day? Give us our daily bread. That's the basic substance. That's the basic need. Give us our needs this day. There's nothing wrong with looking back at memories, right? There's nothing wrong with scrolling through and just remembering. There's nothing wrong with planning ahead, looking ahead, and when am I going to retire? What's this going to look like? What's the future going to, and planning. There's nothing wrong with that. And we need to spend time doing both. But the majority of our time needs to be spent in this moment, in this day. Don't get overwhelmed and don't get frustrated and don't wonder, well, that disqualified me, what I did in the past. And what am I going to do in the future? What's the future going to, what's school starting back going to look like? Oh, and all those things, that's fine. That's something for us to think about and pray about. But we're not promised that. We get that, right? We're not promised tomorrow. Give us today. There's a lot of lessons that Jesus was teaching his disciples in this. But when they went out, he gave them something to do. See, Jesus had his plan. And he was the only one who could multiply that bread and that fish. So all he required of his disciples was just go out and collect what they could have, what they could get. And then he did what only he could do with what they brought to him. Now, how tempting, there's another level of this, how tempting would it have been for these disciples, knowing what Judas did later on, knowing what Peter was up to sometimes, just being whatever whim he felt. How tempting must it have been, whoever found that sack lunch, whoever received it, to take one. You see, the disciples not only had to receive what was given to them and sharing and just trusting that, okay, I don't know what's going to happen to this. This is my lunch, but here you go. But the disciples had to receive it and then bring it to Jesus and let it go, knowing that they were hungry too. You see, we're all involved in this. We all have a responsibility, and there's not everything that God is asking us to do. God did not gift us all the same way. Thank God. He did not wire us the same way with all the same amount of and same kind of personalities. He did not give us all the same amount of resources. He did not give us all the same amount of time. He did not give us all the same level of compassion. You know, there's some people who are gifted with a lot more compassion because they want to give everything away, right? But then there's others that say, yeah, I'm not as compassionate as you are in that because we've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to take care of this. And so it's that balance. God is not expecting you to do everything or be everything. But He is expecting you to do the one thing, at least one thing, that you can do. And think about the ingredients of this miracle. I like to think of the one that was uncounted was the one that gave the beginnings, right? The seed of this whole miracle. Someone had to let something go that they had. Someone had to give something that they brought for themselves. And let's just imagine for a second if it was a young boy that gave his sack lunch, and you think about what had to happen. That mom had to pack that lunch because that's what moms do. It's not a stereotype. It's not saying that dads don't know how to pack lunch. It's just the way we do things. It's mom packed that lunch and put that together, and she made it look nice because for me, when I was packing Trinity's lunch, she knew that it was going to be all thrown in there, and it was probably heavy with carbs and heavy with sweets because that's what I want, right? And so mom knows she needs a balanced meal, you know. So all of this is happening, and so mom is doing what she does, and the boy is only doing what he is doing. He just trusts and he lets it go. And just take that away. What if it wasn't that? Or what if someone in the crowd brought and they came prepared? And they let it go. What if God is asking us to let something go? Give it to Him. A little bit of our time. A little bit of our resources, a little bit more of our faith, a little bit more of our attention. What if God is saying, instead of giving that, what if I'm to give to this? Instead of spending time doing What if God wants me to spend something kingdom-minded? What is that one thing? Instead of being overwhelmed and saying, well, I can't do everything, that we get into this mindset of, well, if I can't do everything, then I get overwhelmed and I just shut down and I don't do anything. I don't know if you're overwhelmed, but we've been overwhelmed at the house before, right? Where it just, especially nowadays, where you're not having people over and it's just, well, for me, I'm a piler. I've admitted to that. I'll wash the towels, I'll do that stuff, and it goes to a pile. Sometimes that pile makes it to a room. And then sometimes that room begins to become the place where everything goes that we don't want to deal with, right? And if you're not careful, you get to that room or that pile and that space, and then all of a sudden you open the door, and a day or weeks go by that you haven't dealt with that pile, you haven't dealt with that stack, you haven't dealt with that room, and all of a sudden what happens? You open that door, what do? You go, deal with. I don't even know where to begin. Anybody ever done that? Or is that just the Tyre house? Okay. So we do that. We get overwhelmed. I don't know where to begin. And I imagine that's where the disciples were. I imagine that's where you are in life. If you neglect something, if you put it off long enough, or in the midst of what we're dealing with now, where it's just something we didn't see coming, and here we are. We don't know what to do. We're just so overwhelmed that we can't control this. Well, we're supposed to back up. And what I'm supposed to do in that mess, because I've had to do that recently, in the midst of that, where does it begin? It can't begin, we've got to do everything. No. It begins with me taking one washcloth and folding that washcloth and starting a pile. Taking that towel, folding that towel, starting that pile. And if I just focus on that one next thing, if I focus on this thing, if I focus on this next thing, instead of looking up and going, oh, look at this. If I can just focus on this. And what if that is really where God wants us to focus? Not just in this season, but in every day. Give us this day our daily bread. I can't control what's going to happen tomorrow. I can't change what happened yesterday. But I can do something about this day. I can look around at my life. I can look at what I have. I can look at who I am, who's with me, and I can say, okay, God, what do you want me to do with this? Where do you want me to start? We can start by loving those that are close to us. We can start by reaching out and checking on those people that are constantly on our minds. We can start by doing what God is asking us to do. Look at verse 41. And Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up to heaven, and he said a blessing, and he broke the loaves. And you talk about the blessing of all blessings, right? That must have been the blessing of all blessings. And he gave them to the disciples, set before the people, and he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So the last thought for you is that Jesus took what would never be enough and made it more than enough. He took it. He took this little bit, and you can imagine the disciples. Just imagine for a second. They're standing beside him because it's a unified effort. But don't you know, as he's blessing that snack, that's all it is. It's a snack. We're not talking about, when you think about loaves of bread, we're thinking like this. We're talking about like this, okay? And we're talking about fish. We're not talking about big catfish, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about sardines. We're talking about the size of my finger here. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a big meal. We're talking about a snack lunch. That's it. And the disciples are watching him like, okay, well, he's praying, guys. Just bow your heads. Is he about to ask us to feed them with that? There's something that happens, though. Once he says, okay, let's disperse these. I don't know how this I've thought about this many times. How it happened, I don't know if it was when they all opened their eyes after the prayer. I don't know how you could close your eyes during that prayer, but they opened their eyes, and then all of a sudden, he's got these baskets in hand. I don't know how it multiplied. I just know that each disciple came along, and he gave them some. And then the next disciple was like, where did that come from? So however it happened, each disciple like already mesmerized. They're already like, okay, we knew what we gave you, but you just gave Peter his share, and you still had enough to give John his, and Judas comes along and you have more. And then think about the awkwardness. The people know how much they have. They heard the prayer. They're closing their eyes. They open it up and going, okay, what's next? There's not a buffet table that just all of a sudden, like a Disney movie, just opens up and pops up because they just sang a song, and then there's this big buffet meal. It doesn't happen like that. Every disciple has to step awkwardly into these crowds of 50s and 100s, and they're walking and they're going, this is going to be really awkward. There's a lot of these that are going to be really hungry and mad at me. And the people are thinking the same thing. Like, what are they bringing us? It'd be like your server. You ordered an extra large pizza because you have a family of 5 or 6, and they bring you one of those personal pan pizzas. You know what I mean? You're like, that's not enough, dude. Somehow, when he gives it to them, and every time they break those pieces and every time they disperse it, it's enough. And can you imagine the conversation? Can you imagine what's happening among the people and among the crowds and among these circles as they're breaking it off? They're just having this conversation like, how did that happen? Does it taste the same? I mean, it's this, and they're eating it and they're enjoying it and it just fills them up and then they have leftovers and it doesn't make any sense. I don't know how it happened, and I could spend too much time. Obviously, I've spent too much time even talking about it with you, thinking about how it could have happened. But here's the deal. It never would have happened if someone, whether it was a little boy or a man or a woman or a couple of people that shared a little bit of what they had or all of what they brought. And it still wouldn't have happened if the disciples hadn't taken it and said, okay, I'm going out and I'm just going to hand out what I have. What if what's holding God back sometimes from doing the miraculous, from doing something supernatural, is that we are refusing to do what just naturally we're supposed to do? What could God do through me just simply sending something encouraging to someone? What could happen with me just simply, especially in a time like this, which I just simply inviting somebody to church with me? What if in the midst of this, God leads me to buy somebody's groceries for them this week? What if God leads me to simply just pick up the phone and old school call somebody and talk to them in person, right? What if God is leading me to do something? And it doesn't make sense, and we sometimes say, well, that's not a big deal, that's not enough. Understand me, right? There's sometimes just an encouraging text changes your day. There's sometimes a phone call changes your day. There's sometimes a card changes your day. There's sometimes receiving something that you didn't necessarily need that makes your day, and it helps you to believe, and it helps you to share. I don't know where you are in life. I don't know what you have. But God knows what you have. And He's asking us to do something that is overwhelming. He is asking us to change the world. He's asking us to be a spark and to fan the flame of revival that is supposed to change lives in our community. So what can we do? I think it starts with simply praying. And it sounds like, well, you're a pastor, you're supposed to say that. I get that. But it's not just praying and just talking. I think just, if we could just spend this week, and here's your homework. If we could just spend this week just giving a focused prayer of just around that thought of, give us our daily bread. What if we just begin to center our thought is, God, help me to be content with what I have now. And then, what do you want me to do with what I already have? I'd imagine that God's going to do something else. Maybe He begins to help us to see that what we already have is more than enough. And if what we have isn't more than enough, then it's going to lead us to trust Him that at some point He's able to multiply what we have and share it. You see, when we give Him something and He blesses that because we've given it to Him, something miraculously happens. It happens with our tithes and our offerings. It happens to me every month. There's not a month goes by that it doesn't make sense sometimes. God takes care of me because I share with Him. My time, when I give Him time, when I give others time, it's amazing how restful I am and how fulfilled I am. There's something about giving something up and thinking that, well, I'm not going to get that back. No, you're not going to get that back, but you get something better back. You bow your heads with me. God, I love you and I'm so thankful for you. I thank you that you love me. I thank you that you love each and every one of us. I thank you for these stories, these miracles that you perform to provide a sense of hope and a sense of challenge and just to inspire us and remind us that you are a God who is able to take this snack lunch and feed thousands of people. And that's just something that we can see. That's something that's visible. That's something tangible. But God, there's a greater miracle at work than even that. And it's the fact that you can take us. You can take our brokenness. You can take our hearts. You can take our sin and you can transform us. You can save us. You can give us hope. You can give us life. And so I pray that in the midst of this season that we're in, of what's next, all the schools restarting and all the uncertainty of what's next for us, and all the uncertainty of jobs and all the uncertainties of the election that's coming up, God, we're not going to talk about what side of the aisle and what our opinions are right now. In the midst of this, we're just trusting you because you're in control. You're a sovereign God. And we trust that whatever happens, that you're going to see us through. So help us to just give you our faith. Give you our life. You're not asking us to do everything, but just the one thing that we can do. So what can we do to make this a stronger church? To make this a healthier community, to make our family stronger? What can we do? And if you're here today, you don't know Jesus as your personal Savior, whether you're here or online, you have that opportunity to just simply invite Jesus into your life. And if there's someone here today that doesn't know Jesus, but you want to know Jesus, will you just lift your hand? Anyone today? Anyone in the house?